Prickett's Fort is a location on the edge of the Toxic Valley and the Savage Divide, east of the crater. This is a very unique location in Fallout 76. But what is it that makes this place so unique? Well, to find out, we need to take a look at the history of this location. In the real world, Prickett's Fort is a state historical and recreational park. It is currently located just north of Fairmont, West Virginia. The original fort was built at the junction of Prickett's Creek and the Monongahela River in 1774. It provided a place of refuge from Native American attacks for the early settlers of the area. The reconstructed fort is also listed on the National Register of Historical Places. The visitor center includes a ticket counter, research library, museum, gift shop, and gallery. Other recreational facilities include picnic areas, nature trails, fishing, and a boat launch. The original fort was built by the community militia and was named after its captain, Jacob Prickett. There were numerous Native American tribes in the area, and when the area was being settled by Europeans, it was a dangerous place. The settlers would use the fort for protection during attacks. The fort itself was never attacked directly by any Native Americans. The original fort was destroyed by the building of a railroad bridge in 1905. The recreation of the original fort was built in 1976 by the Prickett's Fort Memorial Foundation, and now serves as a place of living history. The staff recreates the late 18th century lifestyle through period attire and demonstrations of a variety of colonial crafts. In the Fallout universe, Prickett's Fort is a recreation of the original historic fort. Unlike its real-world counterpart, the Fallout version uses exaggerated references to create a much more elaborate fortified location and is referred to as a representational example of frontier forts. The Society for the Preservation of Historical Recreations and the town of Grafton invested heavily in the fort. The investments were to maintain the reconstruction and increase its attractiveness to tourists by creating a speculative Civil War reenactment. Now that we have that bit of information, let's take the tour and speak to the bots here. The first bot we find is the Confederate Guide.
Welcome to the Prickett's Fort Historical Site. Confederate soldiers never marched on Prickett's Fort, but it's fun to imagine they did. The curator will announce the next show. Please stand by.
At the sign, we find the first stop on the tour.
Dick Shale here, welcoming you to Prickett's Fort Historical Landmark. This amazing moment in time is brought to you by Nuka-Cola. The park features a reconstructed refuge fort and commemorates life on the Virginia frontier during the late 18th century. Join me as we mosey on down the trail to the right for the next part of the tour and take a fascinating stroll through history.
The building in front of the sign is a museum filled with specific items from the Civil War era. The building behind the sign is the ticket counter. There's nothing of note here, but does have a bunch of scrap. So leaving the ticket counter and heading up the hill, we find the second stop on our tour.
This is a typical blacksmith shop, where blacksmiths would make horseshoes, various tools, and perform routine repairs by hand. Blacksmiths had a general knowledge of how to make and repair many things, from the most complex of weapons and armor to simple items. Please proceed to the fort to continue the tour.
There's loads of scrap here, and in the outhouse we find the corpse of one of the Vault 94 ambassadors, which I covered in a previous video, which you can find here. Leaving the blacksmith, we can head to the first guard tower, where we find a holotape titled Isabella Smith Waltz's Journal.
It's my first day here. Oh, this is Isabella Smith Waltz. Can't forget introductions. The Rangers are all so friendly, but, this place is kind of weird. So, this fort was supposed to be a rebuilt frontier fort, but the railroad went through the place where it really used to be, so they had to put it here. And then, they found out the guy who wrote the book that described the fort made most of it up. It's crazy, right? So, it doesn't even look like the real one. We call it a representational frontier fort. Now, they want to start running Civil War battle reenactments here. But that never happened either. But they say it'll bring in lots of money. Some people just don't appreciate real history.
So, Isabella was an employee who seemed to be troubled by the lack of factual history being displayed at the fort. I have to say, I agree with her, but this is common practice in the Fallout universe. Many places would create alternate history to cover up the real history in an effort to generate excitement and patriotism. The government used this tactic often. Heading up to the entrance of the main portion of the fort, we find our next stop on the tour.
Prickett's fort was surrounded by a tall wall with lookout towers for monitoring the area around the fort. Colonists stood watch around the clock and would alert the settlement if the British were approaching. Inside the fort, we'll see what everyday life was like for the colonists. But first, let me tell you about Nuka-Cola. What gives it a unique flavor is the essence of 17 different fruits mixed in just the right proportions to give Nuka-Cola its trademark taste. Boy, Nuka-Cola's refreshing taste really hits the spot, Now, let's continue on with the tour.
Dick Shale mentioned the British, but that too never happened. So, moving on to the next stop at the center of the fort, we find our fourth stop.
This building is the Colonist Company Mess Hall. Colonists would also gather here for settlement meetings.
Moving past the mess hall, we find the fifth stop on our tour.
This is a typical colonist barracks. These buildings housed on average 14 soldiers.
As we move past the barracks, we find the sixth stop on our tour.
Towers were used to monitor the area around the fort. Watch your step on the catwalks.
Moving on from the tower, we find the seventh stop on our tour.
Colonists would typically keep a campfire going while cooking stew or brewing some coffee during the night shift for those who were on watch. Boy, I bet the colonists really wish they had an ice-cold, thirst-quenching Nuka-Cola when those redcoats attacked that early autumn morning. After the tour, be sure to visit the gift shop located northeast of the fort to grab a souvenir and an ice-cold Nuka for yourself.
Once again, the British are mentioned, but there is no evidence that the British ever attacked Prickett's fort. Heading out of the main part of the fort, we can go down the hill toward the gift shop.
Welcome to the gift shop, the final stop on our tour. We'd like to thank you for visiting this historic landmark mock-up of Prickett's fort. I say mock-up because the real fort was destroyed centuries ago. It was lovingly recreated based on a series of documents and educated guesses. Isn't science great? Anyway, don't forget to take home a piece of American history from the gift shop. Oh, and make sure to grab a Nuka for the road. I hope everyone had a swell experience. This is Dick Shale, signing off.
The entire tour was just one big advertisement for Nuka-Cola. The reason for this being that the Nuka-Cola Corporation sponsored the fort. This sponsorship was just another source of revenue for the fort. Personally, I don't have a problem with sponsorships. I do, however, have a problem when it overshadows the history of a place like this. Searching the fort, we find a lot of scrap. There is also a lot of wood piles here, so if you need wood or are trying to complete some wood gathering challenges, this location is a good place to visit. We find the Union Guide in the fort as well.
Welcome to Prickett's Fort, a representational frontier fort of the American West. Union soldiers never had to defend Prickett's Fort, but it's fun to imagine they did. The curator will announce the next show. Please stand by.
Heading back to the ticket counter, we find the curator. This is the bot we need to talk to for the daily quest Buried with Honor.
Hello there. You must be from the Archaeological Preservation Team. I have a real problem here. While building new outhouses, we discovered the remains of a Civil War Union soldier. Although the body is highly irradiated and strangely fresh, it's almost like it died 20 years ago instead of 200. Now I need you to properly inter the body in the Philippi Cemetery, and it needs to be done before our next reenactment. Those remains need a proper burial, although they seem awfully fresh for a Civil War soldier. These bones are strangely well preserved, as if they were only a couple of decades old. But that can't be. I tell you it's not right. Bodies shouldn't be popping up just anywhere. It's almost like a lot of people died recently.
After speaking with the curator, we can head to the cemetery to bury the soldier. Before we arrive, we find the Blood Eagle ambush spot. This was added in as part of the Wastelanders expansion. At the cemetery, we find an open grave. This is where we are to place the bones. It is important to bring a shovel with you, as you need one to complete the burial and in turn complete the daily. While we are here, we might as well explore the cemetery. This location matches closely to the real-world Grafton National Cemetery. This is located in Grafton. The real cemetery contains more than 2,100 Civil War soldiers who died in West Virginia's military hospitals and battlefields. In the Fallout universe, the cemetery is not as big as its real-world counterpart. There is a museum located on the grounds. It houses many Civil War-era items and loads of scrap, but nothing of real note. Heading out to the cemetery, we find a monument with a speaker labeled Philippi Battlefield Cemetery.
Hi, I'm Dick Shale. It's my privilege to welcome you to Philippi Battlefield Cemetery, one of the region's most important historic landmarks. This landmark is brought to you by Blamco brand mac and cheese, America's favorite mac and cheese dish. Kids love Blamco. This monument marks the first organized land action of the Civil War on June 3rd, 1861. The Union had planned a pre-dawn assault on the Confederates. The weather that morning was rainy. Union attackers began firing their artillery, which awakened the Confederates from their slumber. The Confederates retreated about 45 miles to the south. Boy, I bet those Yanks wish they had some warm, delicious Blamco mac and cheese after that. Be sure to check out the Philippi Battlefield Cemetery Museum and see important relics that were used in the battle. This is Dick Shale, signing off.
Again, we see the ugly head of corporate America butting in on the history of the site. Even though Dick Shale says there was a battle here, this is another example of manufactured history to bring in tourists. We see several cannons behind the monument, but nothing else of note. Having explored the cemetery, we can now head back and speak with the curator.
Prickett's Fort is fun for the whole family. Prickett's Fort is a classic example of a frontier fort. Of course, the real Prickett's Fort was located some miles away. When the railroads were built, it was demolished. I must also confess that the references used to reconstruct Prickett's Fort were later discovered to be highly exaggerated.
Prickett's Fort is involved in a few quests. Besides Buried with Honor, it is also connected to the Bureau of Tourism questline. More on that in a future video. There is one event that was disabled in the game called The Battle That Never Was. In this event, after speaking with the curator, you would choose a side, either Union or Confederate. This event was a PvP event where the two sides would fight in a Civil War reenactment. Both sides would fight alongside other robots in a short battle. Obviously, this never happened, but it ties into the tour information quite nicely, and the quest is still in the game files. Now that we have explored both the cemetery and the fort, I want to hear from you. What do you think about the history behind the fort? Have you visited either of these locations? Sound off in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like, subscribe, and share. It really helps the channel, and I appreciate all of you. As always, I'm just glad you stopped by, and I'll see you in the next one.